and welcome to another video by AIA Contract Documents. In today's video, we're going to be talking about designing for a pandemic, design considerations for reopening offices and workspaces in the COVID-19 era. As usual, we are your hosts, Jimmy Germano and Mike Koger. We are both attorneys working in the AIA in the Contract Documents team. Joining us today are Mike Bamba, who is Senior Director and Counsel with the AIA Contract Documents Program and also working with the Risk Management Program. We also have Les Mew, who is the President and Principal Architect for George Mew Associates in Oakland, California. And last but certainly not least, we have Jerry Walters, Vice President for Project Management for MGAC, an owner's rep firm out of Washington, D.C., and Doug Fick, the Senior Mechanical Engineer for CMTA Inc. out of Indianapolis, Indiana. Before we get started into the substance of today's really good conversation, we just have to give a brief disclaimer to explain that nothing you hear today is going to be legal advice per se. The best thing that you can do is to seek appropriate legal counsel with an attorney licensed in your jurisdiction on the particular facts and circumstances at issue. And of course, the full disclaimer is being shown on your screen right now. And without further ado, I will hand the mic over to Mr. Mike Koger to get us rolling.
Excellent. Thank you, Jimmy. And I want to say thank you to our guests that are newcomers on this video, Doug, Les, and Jerry. I really appreciate you taking some time out of your day to come on and talk with us. And I'm going to start with a real threshold question for each of you. And I want to get and talk about kind of the top two issues that you see design professionals and folks in your industry. What are you facing when you're working with clients on reopening and renovating buildings to get workspace and workers back in place in their offices? Jerry, I'd like to start with you. I know you've been working with property owners a lot recently and have been talking with them about their needs in regards to opening back up. What are the top two challenges that business owners are facing when it comes to reopening their offices?
Sure. Thanks, Mike. I think we're hearing from owners all over the country trying to make sure that their spaces are safe and ready for their employees to come back to work. Safety seems to be the number one concern. And then I'd say secondly, folks are thinking about planning for continuity of operations. Should we have another event, a spike in their area where folks need to be going back home for extended period of time, making sure that they have the infrastructure in place to support the remote working if they haven't been able to really build that robust capability now. So I think, again, safety, number one concern, and then building in those options for continuity of operations throughout the course of the COVID event.
That's a couple of good topics. And, I'm curious, when you've been talking with property owners and employers, are they, you mentioned the continuity issue, are they seeing the kind of work that they're going to have to do to their spaces as smaller kind of temporary upgrades that they might need to make, or are they thinking a bit longer term as far as, we need to go through a real design and construction process to think long term about this? Any sense for the way folks are thinking?
Sure. I think right now folks are really just focusing on getting people back, perhaps implementing the more short-term temporary fixes to make people feel safe. And then perhaps over time, as they really understand what the sensitivities are, they can plan for, a bigger renovation if it's necessary, or if they have planned renovations down the road, maybe incorporating some of these features that that are more important now into those longer-term plans. So it seems that it's really more of a short-term temporary fix that they're considering right now, and then, of course, longer-term planning as they really understand what all this means.
Jerry, just to follow up on that for a second, it seems like most of what you've been talking about so far, and I recognize we've only been talking for a couple of minutes, but most of what you're talking about from the owner's perspective it sounds like changes to the physical space, the physical building itself, the office space. Have you heard about changes being made to expected human behavior, so like human interaction in the building, maybe rules that are implemented, or is it mostly changes to the physical space of the building?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a combination of both. I mean, not only are people expecting some physical barriers perhaps and spacing out in the office, but also some of those more social, qualitative type changes that, we've all been practicing at home, staying apart, perhaps implementing one-way corridors throughout their space, limiting the number of people in elevators, smaller meetings, or perhaps continuing to conduct meetings virtually, even if you're in the same office, so that you're not coming into a conference room together. Again, kind of practical solutions to reduce your contact and maintain that physical separation to reduce transmission possibilities.
Have you thought at all, or I guess any of your clients been considering how such rules might be enforced?
Yeah, I think
there's
people are
a
struggling
one-way hallway and someone's walking the wrong way. How would you deal with that?
Yeah, it makes for a sticky situation. I think people are thinking about it. I don't know the right answer, and I don't know that anyone knows the right answer just yet. I think you hope that everyone has the same priorities when they return, and they're thinking about not only making sure that they're safe, their own safety, but they're also thinking about their coworker safety. But it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Many offices have rules of conduct that that are part of their employee manual. Maybe those are updated to incorporate some of the distancing and kind of social etiquette practices that we've learned about over the past few months.
Sure.
But I don't know that I have a hard answer on that just yet. I think that's going to take some time to figure out.
Sure.
I think it gets even more complicated when you're in a multi-tenant building. Perhaps you can set up a framework for your own space and your own employees within the confines of your office space, but it gets a bit more challenging when you're dealing with a landlord and their building rules, and then perhaps the other tenants' rules throughout the building. I know some jurisdictions have implemented best practices or perhaps rules for elevator usage, stair usage, but I don't think that's universal. So I think there's going to be, unfortunately, for some time, a patchwork of rules or best practices to follow, depending on what the jurisdiction's saying, what your landlord's saying, what your company's best practices are. So I think there's going to have to be some meshing of all those rules and practices to come up with what's best for your folks.
Yeah, I think that interaction and the need for both behavior-based solutions and physical and engineering or design-based solutions is really interesting, and it's a way that we kind of sometimes think about buildings, but it's very hyper-focused on both of those combinations. So I'd like to take the opportunity to get our designers into the conversation, Les and Doug. Les, you come with an architectural background, and you've also been working with the Disaster Assistance Committee with the AIA, and was a part of putting out a reoccupancy tool that has been circulating out there in the design industry. Can you talk to us and tell us just a little bit about, what do you think are the top couple of challenges that architects are facing as they're looking to redesign spaces or rethink through spaces?
Well, over just the last couple of months when we've been having forced sheltering, there's been back and forth different lists of what are important things to consider within the redesign of the workspace. And it's varied week to week, but the one that seems to stand out the most and has survived the most criticism and re-examination is the 6-foot social distancing factor. And as an architect and in design, that seems to be the one mandate that is carrying through. We're seeing a re-examination of the possibility of spreading COVID-19 by contact with surfaces. That's now being downplayed. It's not being considered as important as it initially was. So the 6-foot factor for redesign of office spaces and businesses seems to be our significant guide to try to reimagine businesses. The second one, though, is that's pretty pragmatic. And the second issue, I believe, is that going back to fundamentals of our practice as architects, that we need to find within this social distancing a way that we can maintain the collaboration, the comfort, the innovation that comes from the social gathering within the workplace and the businesses that seems to be completely against the 6-foot rule. So we're actually looking at two things that we're trying to mitigate, and they're actually conflicting.
That's a really good point. And you know as well as I do, probably certainly better, that the trend over the last several decades in offices has been more open office space, less rigid walls, less barriers to having face-to-face conversations. Do you see? I guess I'll just ask, how do you go about? What are some of the things you should think about when retrofitting an open office? It sounds complicated, and it sounds like there'd be a lot of clear plastic to me, but barriers. But there's got to be more clever solutions than that, right?
Yes, and I think we'll all be learning together, because during this 2 months or so, I think some business operations never would have considered some of the practices that we're using now, such as working from home, video conferencing. I think there were a lot of businesses that just thought those are interesting ideas, but it really doesn't apply to us. And now we've been forced to actually examine that, and I think realization has come that, hey, technology has been pretty good, and that a lot has been accomplished by not being in the office. So I think our business managers are the ones that are needing to think how the business model can change. They'll be giving us directions as to what the workspace needs to be. Now, I think it's going to be in probably about 3 phases. The first phase is just rapid reopening, where the restrictions are released and people can start repopulating their offices. People have been burning through their cash reserves, so there's going to be just the tactical objectives that can happen in the office, such as calculation about how many people can we actually let in at one time, who's the most critical that needs to be here, determining just from our floor plates how many people could be there. The percentages I've heard from several sources that have been playing with this, including some of the major architectural firms, is that you're going to have to expect about a 50% decrease in the number of occupants in order to meet the current guidelines of 6 foot. Other surveys have indicated 30% of the people that have been working from home have found it works. It's found that it's been effective. And so that many people may never return to the workplace full time. They may only be there certain parts of the day. So when you start looking at those numbers together, you're dealing with repopulating the office of maybe 40% of the people. Is a target number that will actually be fitting into the spaces as they are now. And so with that, using the 6 foot radius, you can see where we can start thinning out the open office to allow for that distance. Because money is tight initially as people come back, and no one's really quite sure how this works. I think your comment regarding plastic screens is very appropriate. Every day now, manufacturers are sending me all these devices and new furnishings and such to rapidly retrofit existing environments to provide screening to supplement the 6 foot distancing. So I think a lot of that in that first phase is just going to be tactical. How do we get in there and just meet the guidelines? Then I think as more restrictions are removed and businesses start to understand how they can effectively operate with a lower workforce, or a workforce that is coming from multiple locations or working in shifts, and there's more management direction on what the workforce in the office is actually looking like, we're going to see more investments as the economy stabilizes in new furnishings, flexible teams can actually relocate the furnishings within the same floor plate. And I think the third phase will be when management is adapted to how they can operate successfully. I think as we start to run out, they're going to reevaluate, do we need this much space? Or is this the type of space that we need? And at that point, I think there's going to be a major reinvention of what the office space will look like, business will look like. And within that time interval, I think our manufacturers and our high-tech companies will be coming forth with all sorts of products I never imagined that will also impact how that office will look. And I think even now, we have resources that we do not use that some businesses have slowly introduced. I mean, the medical industry has many touchless plumbing items, retail industry and security industry has many non-touch access, entry doors, automatic doors, fob controls, and I think you'll see things like the audio control that we're seeing in the home being brought into the office to enhance the touchless environment. So I think we're going to see just a lot of support from the manufacturing and high-tech industries in the ensuing years that's going to help us change the work environment.
I think it's interesting that you mentioned that there are things that we're going to be learning from the healthcare industry, because certainly, designers and engineers who have been working on healthcare projects over the years are going to be more adept, and they're going to be a little bit quicker to be able to adapt. Doug, the reason I'm really happy to have you on this program, there's two of them. One, you're a mechanical engineer, and I don't know a whole heck of a lot about mechanical engineering in buildings. And you've also worked in the healthcare environment for years. So I'm wondering if there are some things that, building owners can learn from the healthcare industry as far as their mechanical systems. And I'm kind of crossing my fingers. Is there just a miracle HVAC thing that we can do to fix this and to make our air safe in our buildings, or is it, I'm assuming it's a little more complicated than that, right?
Unfortunately, it is a little more complicated than that. I'd love to say I had a silver bullet out there to solve the problem, and obviously I think all of the mechanical engineers, as everyone has said, but the safety of the occupants is the primary goal. And you mentioned that the healthcare industry as a basis, they've been dealing with infectious aerosols for a very long period of time. And all of the recommendations, for instance, in the near term regarding facility modifications, really focus probably, I'd say, on two items. One is ventilation, increasing the quantity of ventilation, and there's many subsets to that, and filtration. If you can put filters of higher efficiency in, then you may be able to capture some of the particles that are floating around. But really, it's both of those things, which is utilized in healthcare extensively. But you've been hearing these items also for years. If you think about LEED in giving credits specifically to increasing the quantities of outside air, or as you go forward with well building initiatives, and those, again, ventilation, making sure that it's effective. Is it getting to the occupants? And then again, as I said, just for filtration, those are probably the two biggest things. When you go forward from there, You may start to enter into technologies, for instance, as ultraviolet, and they can be placed in numerous locations. The most common would be in your air handling unit, for instance, downstream of a cooling coil. It has some other benefits of keeping the coils clean, so improved maintenance, but it can have an effect, and depending on how it's sized or utilized, to organisms that are moving past the coil. But it's not a silver bullet.
Interesting. So the idea there is an ultraviolet light or something within your ventilation air handling units that kills viruses and bacterias. Am I understanding that right?
It's correct. Its primary application, if you've seen it or heard of it, is actually to keep the coil clean. The downstream surface of a cooling coil is always wet. And we know what happens to surfaces that are always wet. So it's cool and damp. And so the purpose of an ultraviolet light in those locations is to keep that biofilm off of that coil. It improves the operation of the coil, but it also reduces growth. Its size can be increased, and there's an analysis that you need to weigh as to how powerful you make that, as to how much it may kill as it flies by.
Gotcha. Interesting. Is something like that pretty cost prohibitive for owners to be putting that into an existing system?
No, I wouldn't say it's cost prohibitive. It's with any of these technologies, there's a cost to it. You can actually buy them for your house. You can buy them as a residential plug-in kind of a device, but not to focus on that too much. That I want to go back to ventilation. That's the real of benefit. The mechanical engineer, but that is relative to where you are. What's the quality of the outside air in your specific location, too?
And Doug, would you consider that to be kind of for folks I'm talking to that are they've got their head around the social distancing within the space, and now they're going to that next step. They want to improve the air quality in their building to provide that extra layer of safety and comfort to their employees. Is that kind of the low-hanging fruit to look at the filtration and airflow? Are those kind of simple fixes that they could implement quickly and perhaps cost effectively that's kind of the next step?
It is, and it may be simple, and it may not, and it really depends on your installed infrastructure. I think every healthcare facility utilize their mechanical equipment in economizer or 100% outside air operation almost instantly when this occurred. Their systems had that feature designed. Their systems were robust enough to deal with the climactic conditions at that point in time. Now that we're approaching the summer, they may not be able to maintain the indoor conditions correctly if the system wasn't designed to do that. So back to a commercial space. Does the unit even have that ability? If you go to the most recent versions of energy codes, most systems are encouraged or now required to have it, but older systems may not have the ability. Unfortunately, there are many spaces, many buildings that have minimal or no ventilation, and really then hamper any sort of a strategy like this in a quick turnaround to reoccupancy.
So in that situation, Doug, if the infrastructure is already there and maybe it's not robust enough to handle bringing in all outside air, particularly in the summertime, would it be wise to investigate the possibility of like a portable air cleaner and maybe installing them throughout the building, or is that not a good enough Band-Aid?
No, I think that there are plenty of tools. So the first place I would, if you have limited or no ventilation, would be obviously can you do something with your filter in whatever your system is? Can you increase your filter? Then I think that the analysis should then focus on it's similar to what Les was talking about. How are you working? What are your working environments? Common spaces may be the place that you are most susceptible, and so maybe you don't have to place an air cleaner in the specific office area, but how are you going to control common areas, lobbies, whatever those spaces may be, and then you may want to target some sort of an air cleaner. There are devices, I said ultraviolet earlier, for instance. You have ultraviolet that can be placed in the space. And so obviously you have to be careful of exposure to ultraviolet light, but maybe this is something where your common space, you have an air cleaner for the day. When it's unoccupied and you're sure it's unoccupied, you do a room-based ultraviolet treatment overnight.
But can I add to Doug's comment from I benefit from living in somewhat of a med training environment, and I think Doug listed exactly what we were discovering when we were doing the reoccupancy study, is that more fresh air, actually maintaining a humidity about 40 to 60%, sometimes being able to have negative air pressure in certain areas of your building that may have many people in it won't work for the entire building. But in the climate I am in, that works fine for residential and for some small office and such. In order to achieve Doug's goals, is you pull back the curtains and you open the window. We get our fresh air. We get GUV, which is germicidal UV is daylight. So there's some really simple tactical matters that can happen based upon what your building envelope is.
That's a good point, Doug. I want to hear your thoughts about operable windows. Is that something that you think is a good strategy? And does that affect negatively your ability to control air, or the building operator's ability to control airflow through a mechanical system? Can those two things work together in a helpful way?
On a level, opening your windows is a great thing, and I think, as Les just talked about, that really works in some climates. The operation using operable windows when you have an active mechanical system, things are going to fight each other, so if you look to a lot of sustainable buildings that have incorporated some sort of operable window strategy, they will maybe notify the users, yes, you can open up the windows and we're going to turn the system off. But just to say, well, we're going to leave the mechanical system run and we're going to open up the windows, now you're fighting each other. The other part about opening the windows, the related part is, what are really the conditions outside, and are you on some other level, dust, allergens, particulate, smog, whatever it may be, are you going to solve, maybe make one problem better and make other problems worse?
Yeah, and I think
currently in California.
Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry. Currently in California, under our new codes cycle, our energy conservation requirements interlock our windows with the mechanical system. So we are now being forced that if you open a window, it will automatically alter the mechanical units.
I was just going to, my little tidbit that I wanted to raise was that I think my coworkers would hate me if I had the ability to open up a window. There are going to be some people like myself who would open it up in the middle of a snowstorm because I like it cold in my office. So they probably run into a lot of issues once you start allowing people to do those kinds of activities. But
I wouldn't like that. We share an office wall, so I would
we
definitely. It's a very thin wall, too.
Right. And I would imagine the opposite is true, like in Jerry's case, working, I think, primarily in the D.C. area in the summertime, opening windows really isn't an option. I mean, you sweat enough from the office.
This year.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, a lot of high-rise buildings. I mean, in D.C., our heights are capped, but, in most downtowns, when you have, 10 to 20 or even beyond story buildings, most of the windows, for other reasons, don't open.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I want to switch gears a little bit, and I want to talk about, as designers, architects, engineers, project managers, they tend to think in terms of problems, let's find solutions. But with any ambitious pursuit like trying to retrofit a building comes, for COVID-19 issues, comes risk. And Mike Bomba, that's where I want to ask you. You've been working with the AIA's contract documents department for 13 or so years. You were the principal attorney on the B101 owner-architect agreement when it was republished or updated in 2017. And I'd like to kind of hear some thoughts from you about things that architects and engineers as well, but what should they be thinking about from a risk perspective when they're starting a new project or looking to contract with an owner to provide services like we've been talking about?
Sure. I think they're similar, whether I think it's an initial retrofit type situation or undertaking a new project. And I think a lot of it's from, we've listened to Doug and Les and Jerry talk about, different considerations and different options. But as of now, there's no, we're learning more about this particular virus every day. Original thoughts were it could live on surfaces for a much, longer period of time. And now, as Les was pointing out, well, maybe that what's more important or what's been the most prevalent issue is keeping your 6 feet of distance. So from a designer's standpoint, it's really hard to come into a project and say, all right, architects and engineers by their nature are really good at problem solving. That is the value they often bring to a project, and that's why clients are hiring them. And they want to have the answer. That's sort of their nature. But I don't know that there's a clear answer for any of this right now. And I think that is something that needs to be communicated between the design team and the owner and client to make clear that we don't necessarily have all the answers. Usually adaptation to circumstances is gradual over time, but this is like drinking from a fire hose. The possible solutions are coming at you fast and furious. Les keeps on receiving new product, information in his office every day. Doug's troubleshooting different possibilities, and it depends on the nature of the building that you're dealing with as it was already designed. So I think that there has to be an open and honest communication with the client and it's not so different from how an architect would always define the owner's program for a project. There's always going to be this back and forth, but I think there needs to be a clear understanding between the client and the architect and the design team that we're going to together, let's identify the parameters you want to achieve. Let's figure out how we're going to identify what we're going to achieve. And it may mean that there's an outside consultant, coming on board, whether it's an occupational hygienist or something like that. And I would say, what other consultants does the owner need to hire to identify this program? And then the design team, once you've kind of all on board with what this program is going to be, they can implement their designs to meet this mutually agreed upon program without warranting that no one's going to get sick.
I think that's, Mike, back to my earlier point where many of the clients that I'm talking to are thinking more short-term, perhaps temporary or not permanent solutions, because there are still a lot of unknowns. So I think right now they're just focusing on, again, making the places safe with the information that we have as of today, understanding that 6 months from now, a year from now, we may need to implement some other solutions to continue to provide that safe environment.
And it'll be interesting on the retrofit to get everyone back into the office is one challenge. I think the long term on how much the design industry is going to have to incorporate this will really depend on how much the notion of health, safety, and welfare evolves to adapt, avoidance of communicable diseases. No one cares whether or not the current office space makes you, more susceptible to the flu or the common cold, which is spread in a very similar way. They're all communicable diseases. So, how much of that is going to change, unless you're in a hospital, I suppose it's a very different project. But, how much of that is going to creep into the normal design of a building, or if you're going to redo a building for those who are doing a remodel. I know, sir, we've all been in buildings where you have to turn to the side a little bit just to pass somebody in the hallway. And we've all been in common kitchens and crammed elevators. So, how much of that is going to change, and what's the notion of, how much space should be allotted to an employee within a building. I know Jimmy and I toured a building in our area and it's a large building, 20-some stories, and it is designed to not have dedicated physical space for the amount of people that are in the building. They rely on hoteling and common work areas and people moving throughout the building and working constantly rather than having a dedicated space. And I don't know what the solution is there, but that's going to be an interesting, it'll be interesting to see how much that type of design is impacted by the notion of health, safety, and welfare in the future.
And Mike, you just brought up about 5 different points I want to follow up on with our designers. First is elevators. For example, at our office at AIA National, we have 3 elevators, and one of them tends to kind of not work half the time. And we have like 200 or so employees just within our space that move up and down, and then we have tenants above us. So I guess I'll start with Jerry. You've probably been working through this issue with some of your clients. What are some strategies that you guys are thinking of with regard to how to deal with vertical transportation?
Sure. I think, as you mentioned, within the elevators, limiting capacity to 3 or 4 folks, depending on the size of the elevator, encouraging folks that can and are able to use the stair towers. Again, that presents another issue or challenge where you may have to designate one stair tower as up only and one down only. And then again, you run into additional challenges or some negotiation if you're in a multi-tenant building, because again, multiple companies or organizations are going to be sharing that stair tower. So you'd probably be looking to the landlord to provide some guidance there. It's a real challenge on active construction sites where, particularly for high-rise construction, you're relying on those temporary hoists to get material and manpower distributed through the building early in the morning, and then again in the afternoon when people are trying to get out. And if you're limiting it to just a few folks per car, it really takes a lot of time to get everyone throughout the building, and then double that for all the materials that you're trying to distribute. So certainly a challenge. I think within the office building space, I think we can overcome it by using the stair towers, and perhaps we haven't talked, but some companies are looking at staggering their workforce hours either by day or by splitting the day in half. People work in early period, and then half may work early, half may work late, so that reduces the need for the elevators. So I think within the typical office space, you can probably overcome it by incorporating some of those strategies and incorporating the stair or encouraging the stair usage. On construction sites, I think it's another challenge. Again, you may have to look at loading in materials overnight and then just using the elevators for staff during the day. Again, to the extent that you can, encouraging stair usage, but you may not have suitable stairs for folks to traverse the building during the construction period. So it certainly creates a logistics problem.
Absolutely. Les, do you have anything to add about that, about vertical transportation? Have you seen any kind of unique strategies? It seems like a very limited number of options that you can have to deal with that issue, but anything different?
Yeah. No, I kind of agree with what has been said. I think a major factor that we're not really going to know about is the reduced number of people that will be returning to the workforce over any particular time. Not only will be less people showing up, there will also be staggered work times. So the actual number of people may be significantly different. So things that I've been seeing is, having the queuing lines at elevators, dedicating elevators to certain floors to help expedite that and cut the lines down. Going a little further out, removing the need for pushing buttons and such by using your smartphone, having smartphone interlocks to the controls for your elevators. That's going to the touchless office mode. I mean, we have so much of that technology already existing, even voice control to tell an elevator where to go. I think one of the important things to look at, though, is that in a lot of these changes of circulation and access, we have to be careful about the ADA commitment that we have, because many of these processes actually limit accessibility, or we have to be careful and be able to accommodate that.
Well, that's a good point. I can imagine elevators predominantly being reserved for folks who have accessibility issues, and not just disabled people, but most recently I couldn't walk up a flight of stairs because my knee was hurt. So I can imagine the able-bodied folks take the stairs and everybody else crowd into the elevators one at a time. So one other thing that you touched on, Les, was touchless design. I'm the kind of person who absolutely hates reaching out and grabbing a gross door handle or touching a gross keypad in an elevator. So I'm thrilled to hear about the idea of touchless design. Can you talk a little bit about some of the other kind of, to use Jerry's phrase, low-lying fruit that folks, that owners can look to kind of make touchless design happen kind of quickly?
Sure. I mean, there's been a lot of thought and about the future, but just today, now, we have actually a lot of devices that have been developed for specialty markets that have the ability to be adapted. Door controls, automatic openers, door assists. That got a big boost with the ADA requirements. And for a while, there was no such thing. But in recent years, it was very common. So retrofitting doors to be self-opening, exchanging a touchpad, for instance, by perhaps audio controls. I mean, that's all available stuff that can happen. Hospital-type plumbing fixtures that sensors on faucets, toilets, self-cleaning toilets, things like that. They exist. Perhaps the market has not been large enough to make them economical, but I think this pandemic is going to change that. It's very similar to initial accessibility requirements when all of a sudden we were told you can't twist your hand to open the door. And all we had was 99% knobs. And so within 3-4 years, the entire industry changed, and now levers are predominant. So I think industry is going to catch up with these needs. They're going to start converting things that are out there that are readily available that can be used. The security industry and life safety industry has done a tremendous amount of work on access controls. And that type of feature combined with some of these other mechanical operators on doors and such can be combined together so that you can access the door with a fob or a voice control, some other identity recognition device, similar to the security cards that people already carry around that will give you access in a touchless environment. So I think there are a lot of things out there. The commercial retail industry has used automatic doors for decades now with great success. Costs of those come down tremendously.
Yeah, very good points. I'm even thinking of, the way they do something as simple as like the way they do restrooms in airports. There's typically not a door. And in fact, there's a lot of restrooms that I'll go into even at our office where you have to grab the door handle and twist it and push it open. Well, you probably could just take that door off because it's kind of got a blind corner or two before you get back. So I think there's a lot of options, and the high-tech ones are really interesting too.
So, well, within toilet rooms alone, one of the current phases that we're going through now is a movement towards full-height toilet partitions, totally enclosed cubicles, which has been more of a style movement as well as one towards multi-sex restaurants. But they also meet the needs for the COVID-19 era.
So we're getting kind of near the end of the time that we had allowed for this video, but we definitely haven't talked about all the issues that we had even thought about in our kind of pre-planning. I'm wondering if there's anything that we've missed out on that folks think of that are, go around kind of the table here, and just is there one thing that we've missed out on, or one or two things that you can think of that we really need to address before we start to wrap things up?
I think we talked around it a little bit, but just as we think about returning to work and modifying the physical space to make everything safe and attractive for folks to come back, there's a technology piece that we need to make sure is addressed, so that as folks continue to work from home or continue to conduct meetings virtually, that infrastructure is robust enough to handle the increased volume. I think many folks have been forced into this work from home situation very quickly, and I think have been kind of making their way through. But now that we know that this is likely not going to go away anytime soon, you need to make sure that your technology infrastructure is designed and built out to support that continued use.
Absolutely. I think all the folks that were, like myself, that were dragging their feet on kind of new technology, we've all got a baptism by fire over the last 2 months. We're all on the video sharing platforms and everything else. Doug or Les or anyone else, any kind of major things that we should be touching on?
I guess I would say I touch on a couple of things. ASHRAE, I just made mention, their website is full of a lot of very good information on this topic for designers. Mike mentioned this earlier, having a clear plan, particularly for the mechanical systems, but having a clear plan and what are your objectives, what are you concerned about for reopening and going forward. The two items we haven't touched on, I would say water systems. If the building has not been occupied for an extended period of time, dealing with the water systems, flushing, getting rid of getting clean water in there, I guess is the best way to put it. The other part I would say is returning just to the core mechanical systems, if you want to say retro-commissioning, but is the system even operating as somebody anticipated it when it was first put in? And so if you're trying to improve ventilation, is it actually doing it now? If you're trying to improve its operation, isn't even at its basic, what is that starting point? So,
I think to reinforce the point that Mike made, as designers, we cannot promise elimination of all risk. There's going to be an amount of that. I think a big turning point will be when a vaccine is available. And then we can start moving to that third phase where we're reimagining what the office can be. And it can be complete, the huge unknown that we can't control that affects much of what the return of employees is how they get to work. Public transportation we can't control. So testing of employees, all that type of thing, be part of the administrative solutions until we can get to a point where we have somewhat of a herd immunity to COVID. People will be sick. I think even under a flu pandemic, one of the simplest, straightforward ways to, I think workplaces represent about 16% of infection of healthy people. And one of the simplest ways to deal with that is to offer 6 days pay. I mean, it has nothing to do with building a wall. So we need to keep our eyes open, and I think as architects, we are not trained as hygienists. We need to have reliable resources and, CDC, whatever. We need to have something we can refer to for our owners and such to say these are accepted practices and standards, and it's the best we know and we can deal with.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Exactly. Okay, so with that, I think we'll wrap things up here. I do want to take another opportunity to say thank you to everyone. Doug, Les, and Jerry, thanks for taking your time to do this. It was a really, I think it was helpful for me to understand the issues a lot better, so I assume it's going to be helpful for folks to listen to this, to kind of think through these issues as everybody's getting back to work over the next couple of months. And I should say that we haven't really talked about AIA contract documents, which is the department that 3 of the 6 of us work with. But if you have issues or questions about contracts, you can always call us or go to our docinfo resource page. Some of that information is now on the screen. We have all kinds of resources for architects, for contractors, if you're looking for agreements, standard form agreements to look at to procure those kinds of services. We have an abundance of those, as well as other resources and videos like this that we've shot over time dealing with a variety of issues. A lot of them are COVID-19 related. So with that, thank you all very much, and goodbye.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.